Hello, my name is Deborah Dwork, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the sixth and last of a year-long virtual series on the marginalized and the erased. The historical record is marked by voids, elided events, disappeared people, erased accounts, marginalized communities. This series has tackled a number of those blank spots in history and in our own time. I thank our series partners, NYU's Professor Emerita of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, Marian Kaplan, and Stockton University Professor Raz Segal. It is Raz who will engage our guest, Sarah Ihmoud, in a discussion today. I thank, too, Center Associate Juan Acevedo, on whose help I rely, Dr. Eli Karetny, Deputy Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute, for his support, Michael Ekstrom for his outreach communications, and the GC's terrific IT people, Brad Holscher, Steve Thomas, and Eric Williard. Above all, I am grateful to our discussants and to everyone who has tuned in. Thank you for your engagement. It is now my pleasure to say a few words about Raz, who will introduce Sarah. Raz Segal holds the position of endowed professor in the study of modern genocide, and he serves as the director of the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. The author of the path-breaking study, Genocide in the Carpathians, War, Social Breakdown, and Mass Violence, 1914 to 1945, Raz comes to us today from Austria, where he is a senior fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, writing a book titled Holocaust Bystanders, A History of the Modern State. I called Genocide in the Carpathians path-breaking, and I take a moment to elaborate. Drilling down on the interwar multi-ethnic context of that region, Raz trained his eye on history as a dynamic of changing relationships and responses. Most significantly, his research led him to situate the mass murder of Subcarpathian Rus Jews in the broader terrain of ethnic conflict and the larger frames of Hungarian plans for violent population transfer and German plans for the annihilation of the Jews. In Genocide in the Carpathians, Raz presents a new understanding of genocide, genocide against entire societies, in addition to targeting specific groups in those societies, and a new and innovative way to link the Holocaust, genocide, and settler colonialism. Which brings us to our discussion today on Beyond the Settler State, Anti-Colonial Pasts and Futures in Palestine, Israel. Raz, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I'd like to begin and say that the intention of our conversation today is constructive. We seek to encourage people in the audience or those listening to the recording to consider new questions about Israel and Palestine, new ways of thinking about Israel and Palestine, and new future possibilities. We invite you to join us in new discussions that will take us beyond a history and present of exclusionary nationalism, Israeli settler colonialism, and systematic state violence against Palestinians. We believe in different futures, which are crucial for all those who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. With these words in mind, it is a particular pleasure and honor to introduce the person with whom I will be in conversation today, an incredible scholar, educator, activist, Dr. Sarah Ihmoud. Dr. Sarah Ihmoud is a Chicana Palestinian anthropologist whose work uplifts the lived experiences, histories, and political contributions of Palestinian women and Palestinian feminism. Dr. Ihmoud's scholarship has been published in the scholarly journals American Anthropologist, Feminist Anthropology, Cultural Anthropology, Feminist Studies, State Crime Journal, and others. Her research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Palestinian American Research Center, PARC, the Venner Green Foundation for Anthropological Research, and the National Endowment for Humanities. She's a founding member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and is assistant professor of anthropology at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. The first part of our conversation, around 15 to 20 minutes, will be framed around a couple questions that I will present to Dr. Ihmoud. Dr. Ihmoud then might have some questions for me. We will then respond to some questions from the audience, which you can type into the Q&A box, and we'll leave at the end a couple minutes for closing remarks. Dr. Ihmoud, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. What is settler colonialism, and how does a feminist lens allow us to better understand settler colonialism in Palestine? Please.
Thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. I want to thank Deborah Dwork and the CUNY Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity, as well as Raz Segal and the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Stockton University, Juan and Eli, who've been super supportive, and along with their colleagues who have made the space for this conversation possible. It's an absolute honor to be here with you all. And to everyone, ahlan wa sahlan. Ahlan evokes the meaning of kin, which is to say, I'm greeting you as kin. The recognition that we are each other's people. Sahel, welcome to a plateau after climbing the terrain. And I'm beginning here with a reminder from my friend, Dr. Hana Massoud, a Palestinian psychologist who teaches us that in these terms that we use every day, in our very language as Palestinians, we have these healing messages and energies. And I want to root us in our conversation, as Raz spoke about earlier, with this intention that this conversation be a seed for our collective liberation and healing, that we use every opportunity that we have to grow and learn and shift together. And this is part of the praxis of Palestinian feminism, that we build an intentional community grounded in care and love, and that we create spaces where we can gather strength and radical hope for the long-term liberation struggle for our people. And I think it's important to say from the outset that the questions that Palestinians are raising for and among ourselves reverberate far beyond our communities. So I want to begin by defining settler colonialism, and then I'll delve a bit into what it means to understand Israeli settler colonialism through a feminist lens. When I say a feminist lens, I want to specify a decolonial feminist lens, which is different from liberal Western or colonial feminism, which, as we know, too often has been weaponized against Palestinian women and others as a way to culturally pathologize our communities and justify military intervention in the region, right? We're familiar with the ways that this liberal feminist agenda has been used to legitimize military intervention in the name of protecting the figure of the oppressed Arab or Muslim women. So what do we mean when we say that Israel is a settler colonial state? We mean that Israel is a colonial project that is predicated on a logic of native elimination, a project that destroys in order to replace, that aims to destroy native Palestinian life in order to replace it with a new settler entity, and a project that is structural and continuous, not an event. And this is why Palestinians say that the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, when 750,000 Palestinians were violently removed from their homeland in the creation of the Israeli state, is not an event, but is a structure that continues to shape the conditions for Palestinian life in the settler colony and in diasporic spaces. So to expand on this a bit further, Zionists arrived from European countries to a land that was already inhabited by Palestinians, and instead of attempting to form some kind of integration within the social and political frameworks of the indigenous population and the wider Eastern Mediterranean region of which it was a part, they worked to destroy our social relations and to replace this whole Palestinian world-making project with a political community of their own, right? And when I say that Zionist colonialism worked to destroy our social relations, I mean our relations with each other as a people and our relations with our homeland, which are vitally interconnected. You know, for example, historian Salim Tamari writes about the thriving cosmopolitan urban tradition that had grown in coastal cities like Jaffa and Haifa that were completely disrupted during the Nakba when our communities were physically removed and expelled. So that is to say that the ruptures that we experienced as a people from our homeland were also social and cultural ruptures, right? And in these ways, Zionism is not a major departure from an otherwise established pattern of settler colonialism that we see in many other cases, including the United States, right? It rests on this wider imaginary of an empty land, right? A land without people for a people without land that is characteristic of settler societies alongside this process of the indigenization of the settler. That is the claims of the settler to being or inhabiting a primary category of indigeneity, which provides the sort of psychic and moral legitimacy for colonial violence and theft. In the Zionist imaginary, this manifests in the central idea that the Jewish people have been the chosen people and that they are returning, right, to an ancient homeland rather than displacing a native population in society. And one important aspect to highlight here, I think, and to delve a bit further into are the racial characteristics of this project and of Zionism as a movement. And historian Alon Confino, who was supposed to be with us here today, has argued that, quote, Zionism as a movement brought together Eastern European style late 19th century and early 20th century ethno-nationalism with the practices and racial ideologies of 19th and early 20th century British style settler colonialism. Zionism is one movement within a whole host of others that viewed ethnic homogeneity as a precondition for the construction of a European style political order and ethno-national states as the natural building blocks of a modern global order, end quote. So I'm highlighting this because I think it's important that when we're talking about this idea of liberation, part of what this tells us is that rather than challenging the racialized Orientalist image that excluded and subjugated the Jewish people historically in Europe, right? Zionism internalized and reproduced these logics. And Palestinian legal scholar Nuda Arakat has highlighted that that Zionism, again, as a derivative of Enlightenment Europe, reproduced these polarized binaries of a superior enlightened West in relation to an inferior primitive East, right? It claimed that Jews as a national entity belonged to the superior enlightened West, despite their geographical origins in the East, and sought to enlighten or colonize its primitive people. So in essence, Israel's founders reified European supremacy and ascribing new value onto Jewish subjectivity and nationality in relation to a racialized Arab other, the Palestinian. And through an assertion of Zionism, according to Abu Laban and Bakan, the non-white Jewish victims of anti-Semitism could assert a bridge from non-whiteness to whiteness, identifying with European global hegemony. So there is a racialized structural inequality set up in the settler colony that hinges on these categories of the settler and the native population, right? And that structural inequality is maintained through a host of strategies, through the fragmentation of the indigenous population into separate geographies that are governed by legal structures that ascribe a particular value to Jewish identity, what Rabia Agwaria has called Jewishness as property, through the unequal distribution of land and resources, through the violence of military occupation, including Israel's recent shoot to kill policies, through mass incarceration, through holding an entire population captive. So this racial hierarchy and Enlightenment tradition of who is worthy of political rights, who is worthy of being a people, who is worthy of life and sovereignty, continues apace. And the Zionist enterprise has the same problem now as it had in the 1890s, right? How do you forge a Jewish democratic entity on a piece of land where the majority of people on the land are not Jewish, right? So Zionism was a response to European anti-Semitism, to European racialization, at least the form that it took with Israeli settler colonialism. And unfortunately, it took on these very logics that exclude the Jewish people and reified them. So I suppose, I'm emphasizing this point to say, plainly, what kind of liberation has Zionist colonialism in Palestine actually offered a historically subjugated people? And I think the affective or emotional investment in this project needs to be unpacked, and I'll try to talk about that a little later in our conversation. And I know I've been speaking a bit already, but I want to return to this idea of what a feminist analysis of Palestine helps us hone our attention to. I think it does a couple of things, right? First, it names gender and sexual violence as central to the larger structure of settler colonial power and this racialized machinery of violence. As with Native women in other contexts, colonizers and rigid nationalists treat our bodies as Palestinian women as a cultural locus and a symbolic periphery. Because we carry the possibility of giving life to the next generation of Palestinians, and with that, right, the seeds of alternative political orders and futurities that are contestations of the colonial regime. And we can talk a bit more about the specificities of these dynamics a little later in the conversation, but it is because we are constructed as these kind of biological or biologized internal enemies that Palestinian women and queer can live in an elevated state of siege. And second, a feminist analysis names the dynamics between settler colonialism and patriarchal violence within Native society. Understanding that colonial violence changes and intensifies the dance with patriarchy that Palestinian women are already entwined in, right? This is in part rooted in the ways that settler colonialism has sought to manipulate patriarchal forces within the colonized society since the Nakba. And the systematic violence of the state has really altered the fabric of Palestinian social life and shifted power relations within our communities, including gender relations. So as feminists, to echo the Combahee River Collective, we struggle alongside Palestinian men against Zionist colonial violence and oppression, while at the same time, we struggle against heteropatriarchal violence and abuse within our own community. And these dynamics manifest in different ways in different spaces of Palestine and Palestinian diaspora. And as a final point, I want to emphasize that a feminist approach to understanding Israeli settler colonialism really holds Palestinian women's resistance and life-making practices at its center. And this is important because, as numerous Palestinian scholars have pointed out, while there is value in understanding settler colonialism as an ongoing structure, this analysis can be overdetermining. That is, it can limit our imaginary of the possibilities for undoing the structure, right? Sometimes it eclipses our attention to the practices of Palestinian life-making that are always present, that are always ongoing within this structure. So to conclude, right, decolonial feminist praxis is an adamant refusal of Zionist settler colonialism and its entwined logics, and at the same time, it's animated by the urgency to nurture and create alternative ways of being, alternative ways of knowing and relating to each other that are not rooted in hierarchical structures of humanity or nationalism. And reclaiming our power, even in these quotidian, everyday spaces of life. And this is what our intergenerational movement histories teach us through rebuilding home, through loving each other, through protecting our kinship, through nurturing and rerouting connections to land and sacred space, through telling our stories and teaching the next generation how to survive and organize in our communities. These acts fundamentally shift dynamics of power and landscapes of struggle. And they show us that even within the condition of coloniality, there is the force of Palestinian life and world making. So what does it mean to displace anti-Palestinian racism and the death worlds of settler colonialism from the center of our thinking? I think it's vitally important, and it's a feminist imperative to think with and nurture these practices of Palestinian life and world making. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And on that note, where you stopped, actually, maybe a few more minutes, you can talk more specifically on how should we move collectively together, as you emphasized at the beginning, beyond the settler states towards anti-colonial future. What possibilities do you see? What obstacles? What joint actions? What imaginative frameworks?
Thank you, Raz. This is a great question, or set of questions, and I won't be able to answer them all, but I'll start somewhere. I think Palestinians are already making and growing anti-colonial futures in their everyday resistance to the violence of settler colonialism in Palestine. Our movement histories teach us that our people have been creating and enacting the blueprints for our collective liberation for generations. By creating alternatives to colonial violence and practicing the alternatives in movement in real time, whether we're talking about the mass popular resistance of, for example, the first Intifada, where Palestinian women were creating a network of women's committees that organized economic cooperatives, organized childcare centers to provide safety for children, organized literacy campaigns. They were forming all of these autonomous, thriving communities and forms of popular resistance to care for our communities. Or if we're talking about everyday life where Palestinians are nurturing connections to the land or for their families and communal relations in the face of these various structures and policies that are really aimed at fragmenting our kinships, fragmenting our relationships from each other. We have to understand all of these acts, these everyday acts and these collective acts as future-oriented and futures building. And collectively, I think in recent history, one of the greatest examples of this collective moving toward anti-colonial futures was the 2021 uprising, where Palestinians from across the homeland, from Gaza to those situated within the state, to those in the occupied territories, came together and emphasized that we are one people, that we are one Palestine, and that this is an anti-colonial struggle. There was a refusal of colonial violence, a refusal of the ongoing conditions of fragmentation and separation that have been forced upon us as a people. And there was a refusal of the solutions that have been forced upon us by colonial and imperial powers. And at the same time, there was a collective expression of desire for a liberation that can only come through decolonization. We saw the reemergence of this language of anti-colonialism as of decolonization that has sort of been stripped away from us through various political processes in recent decades. Now, when we talk about the collective we, I think, your question about how we can collectively move toward this together, how might this extend to our Jewish siblings, right? And what does this mean in terms of the Israeli state? And that is an entirely different, though not unrelated question, I think we can consider. I think one possible opening to consider this question is through the recent mass protests against judicial reforms, right? We're in the midst of a moment where we're witnessing a real reckoning of the settler state with its own internal contradictions. And the way that this moment has been represented largely in the West is sort of kind of this apocalyptic moment, right? Where the integrity of Israeli democracy is at stake. And at the same time, across Palestine, whether among Palestinian communities inside the state or those in occupied territory or in the diaspora, we see largely a disinterest, right? If not an outright turning away or rejection of the protests. And so how do we read this? I want to suggest that we read this as a refusal to entertain or become trapped within the desires embedded in the fears of our oppressors, rooted in the lived and embodied experience of the apocalypse that settler colonialism has already thrust upon us as Palestinians, both materially and psychically, right? Dakota scholar Kim Tallbear reminds us that the apocalypses that Indigenous and Black people have suffered since the colonial encounter are blossoming into present day settler reckonings, settler state reckonings. So at the same time that Zionists are empowered by this moment where the genocidal rhetoric and policies of Israeli leaders are providing impunity for ongoing crimes and justification for the accelerated theft of Palestinian land and life, liberal Zionists are grieving what they interpret as the contemporary implosion of the democratic ideals of the state that has offered the Jewish people a sense of historical protection and home since its founding in 1948. And I think that grief is really interesting to witness and think with. So what I want to say in part is that moving collectively toward anti-colonial futures invites us to follow Palestinians' lead in this moment in divesting from the idea that liberation is possible within the Israeli state framework, right? Within the nation state framework more generally. And this requires a radical honesty about a few things, that Palestinian freedom has never been dependent on a liberal Zionist agency, that decolonization is about a radical rupture with the dominant order, which is a violent and genocidal order. And the resurgence of the language of anti-colonialism or decolonization, I think, really frightens a lot of people, even those people who really want to see change, because of its capacity to destabilize prevailing norms and structures, and because it inevitably implies that those who identify with and benefit from those prevailing norms and structures will have to give something up. So one question becomes, I think, for Palestinians, if we refuse to entertain the desires of our oppressor, including the desires of liberal Zionists who continue an investment in the imaginary of Israeli democracy, a desire that's inherently tethered to the material benefits they continue to reap from Jewishness as property, a desire that provides the illusion of safety from confronting their own psychic investment in our demise as a people, what alternative desires are we cultivating? And we see these alternative desires, again, as Palestinians being cultivated in everyday practices of love and care, where we're building communities of struggle with each other, where we're developing new ways of relating to each other, and where we're invested in collective healing from the ongoing trauma of colonial violence and oppression. And these varied but interconnected forms of rebellion are citations of a long history and tradition of the Palestinian liberation struggle, articulations of really a collective genius and magical thinking of our people whose very survivance and Ihmoud performs the failure of Zionism as a political project. So I think that, world ending and world making have always happened and are continuing to happen simultaneously. And I want to end by saying that this moment offers an opportunity for all of us to stop cultivating desire for the fantasies of the settler state, no matter who's in power, alongside the desire for a state nationalism and the accompanying logics of sort of gendered racial colonial modernity. And that desire is not just psychic or emotional, but has to be invested in the collective struggle to confront the predatory structure of Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine. And it's our relationship to each other and community that really inspires and informs political risk-taking. And this moment opens up space. It invites us, if we choose to take the opportunity, to be undisciplined, to choose to be misaligned with the affective, intellectual, and unethical standards of those in power. And instead, we can take this opening as an invitation to continue to create and cultivate different kinds of relations that are oriented toward collective healing and more liberatory futures. So, thank you, Raz. A couple of questions for you. First, we were just touching base and thinking together, and I was remembering as well that our first introduction was really in the midst of the 2021 uprising, when you were organizing a statement of solidarity with the Palestinian people on behalf of scholars of mass genocide, mass violence and genocide. And my first question, why has Holocaust and Genocide Studies been so reluctant to call what is happening in Palestine a genocide? And what do you see as the intellectual and ethical task of scholars of mass violence in this moment, in this context?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your words about possibilities for a decolonial future, and thank you for your question. Actually, I think that I see a significant change in the treatment of Israeli state violence, apartheid policies, and settler colonialism within Holocaust and genocide studies. This change has taken a long time, and many, I think, will continue to push back. But our conversation today, for instance, organized by a center in this field of Holocaust and genocide study, seems to me a part of this shift. There's also clear indications of this shift in scholarly journals in Holocaust and genocide studies. I can mention here 2 book forms published in recent years in the Journal of Genocide Research, one on the co-edited volume by Dr. Amos Goldberg and Dr. Bashil on the intertwined histories and memories of the Holocaust and the Nakba, and another on Dr. Nadia Shalom-Kevorkian's last book on the structural everyday brutalities of Israeli authorities against Palestinian children and youth, which she calls unchilding. I think it was very significant that in both forums, in the Journal of Genocide Research, we saw multiple perspectives that demonstrate the great extent to which discussions about Israel and about Palestine offer opportunities to delve into key issues and questions in Holocaust and genocide studies. I also want to mention an example from my program that I direct, the Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton, which we admitted on a full fellowship, a Palestinian student from Hebron, who is now in the final stages of research and writing an excellent paper on Palestinian refugees who had fled from Syria to Jordan and from there to Europe after 2011. She is actually working in the frame of a new focus in our program on refugees and displacement, with other students working on Urdu-speaking Bihari people and Armenians. And if you think about it, with over 100 million forcibly displaced people around the world today, 100 million, refugees and displacement is indeed a central issue in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And with Palestinians as a group that has faced and is facing the longest ever experience of forced displacement and the refusal of return to their villages, their towns, their cities, their homeland, Palestinian history is indeed central, I think, in Holocaust and Genocide Studies and becoming more and more so. Finally, I want to mention that the fact that some institutes of global Holocaust memory, and I'm thinking particularly here about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA, that these institutes have weaponized the discourse around anti-Semitism to shift the focus of the struggle against anti-Semitism away from Jews around the world and only onto Israel. This effort, I think, has backfired and actually contributed to the centering of Israel and Palestine in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Let me, in a minute or two, explain. The weaponizers now demand that the historical struggle to protect the people, Jews, from violent states now changes to protect a violent state, Israel. And as the violence of the state becomes more and more well documented and clear, and it becomes more and more absurd and cruel to try to rationalize or deny it, it also becomes more and more clear that the only rationale really for this weaponization, it seems to me, is that the idea that somehow Jews are unique, and therefore Israel, framed as a Jewish state, somehow has to be unique as well. And therefore also justified to have an international discourse devoted solely to this one state, which is manifested today in quite a lot of places in laws and regulations about what one can say and what cannot say about Israel, that is regulating the denial and distortion of Israeli settler violence. Now, more and more Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholars are becoming more and more uncomfortable, I think, to put it very lightly, with this upside down world. And I suspect also uncomfortable with the line of thinking that got us here, namely that Jews are somehow unique, because thinking about Jews as unique has actually historically fueled the discrimination, persecution, and violence against Jews. Now, perhaps this realization pushes more and more people, including more and more scholars in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, to open their eyes fully to the violent reality of the Israeli settler state and see why indeed it's central in discussions in our field. I also hope that it pushes more of us to partake in the ethical task, what I see as an ethical task that is a legacy of the struggle against anti-Semitism, that is to support and protect a group, Palestinians, from a very violent state, Israel. So that's very briefly, I think, in response of where we are in Palestine and Israel and Holocaust and Genocide Studies.
Thank you so much, Raz. And I really appreciate the thoughtfulness in bringing, both your analysis of the sort of shifts currently happening in Holocaust and Genocide Studies into conversation with the weaponization of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and so forth, and how that has actually been detrimental to combating global anti-Semitism. It's very interesting to explore and important. I have, I guess, another set of questions that is in relation to these broader thinking about kind of the psychic and affective divestment from the Israeli settler colonial project. So we're talking about divesting from Zionism, especially in the language of anti-colonialism or decolonization, and moving away from the state. There's a very material stake as well as an emotional or affective stake or dimension to this. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for folks who are implicated in the position of sort of liberal Zionist, or what are the fears around potentially divesting from Zionism and the idea that the Israeli state will always exist? And what are the possibilities of that potential shift?
So I don't think that I can talk in the name of liberal Zionists, but I can say that I think for me, in regards to divestment, the key is the language of decolonization that you mentioned. I think it addresses really the founding principle of the settler state, which is as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. And those Palestinians who remain are always already seen as quote unquote a problem, right? A potential security risk, an enemy. I think the settler rational, and because of the settler rational, again, decolonization I think is key, but the settler rational really explains the history of the state from the very beginning, the cruel and arbitrary military regime until 1966 over Palestinians who managed to remain in Israel following the 1948 war and the Nakba. The settler rational explains the way in which the borders of, quote, United Jerusalem were drawn by Israeli generals after the 1967 war. The settler rational explains the, quote, temporary military occupation over the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the many decades since then. And the settler rational explains the systematic attacks against Palestinian citizens in Israel throughout. You can think about the forced displacement and demolitions of Bedouin settlements, all the way to the nation state basic law from 2018 that officially turns Israeli Palestinians into second-class citizens with an explicit system of Jewish supremacy and actually a celebration in the language of the law of the Jewish settler project. So as a Jew and myself as a scholar of the Jewish world and a scholar of modern mass violence, including the Holocaust, I, of course, stand firmly against this violent settler state in the past and in the present. I mean, I oppose any state that operates according to ideas about supremacy of one group over others. Divestment in this framework, again, thinking about decolonization. So divestment from Zionism in Israel is for me then a way to imagine, consider, think, aspire to different futures for everyone living there. That is thinking beyond, above, around, beneath the settler state. Now, the material dimension, which you note, Sarah, which I think is very important, should be key, of course, in all decolonization efforts. Though we know that usually, ultimately, land acknowledgements, for example, prove much, much easier for universities in the US and Canada than the allocation of funds, resources, and land, indeed, to processes of reparations, accountability, and justice in relation to Indigenous genocide and ongoing assaults. So for me, again, as a Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholar, not a liberal Zionist, the material dimension combines with divestment as an intellectual and educational project. So I'm thinking, for example, about centering the voices of Palestinian students and scholars by providing significant funding for them to study in Holocaust and Genocide Studies program and shape from within how we talk about Israel, how we talk about Palestine, about Palestinian history and culture, and indeed about futures beyond the settler state, bringing in feminist perspectives, the often neglected voices of Palestinian refugees, and many other issues and questions. We can think that the more the Israeli army attacks Palestinian campuses in the West Bank, the more that Israel refuses to allow Palestinians in Gaza to leave to study elsewhere, the more we need to bring Palestinian students and scholars into Holocaust and Genocide Studies programs. And that, of course, has clear material implications. This is one way in which I can think about decolonization, for example, from my own perspective. Now, there are, of course, additional ways to think about this and many other possibilities, but I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Raz.
I think that with this, we'll move to collecting some questions from the audience. Right. Let me, Sarah, ask you a question here. I'm quoting the question. I want to hear more about the role of women in challenging patriarchy and gender inequality within their own communities. Can you describe women's organizations and feminist movements that have emerged in Palestine over the past several decades, advocating for women's rights and pushing for greater gender equality in all aspects of society?
Yes, thank you for the excellent question. And I'd love to share a little bit about it in the limited time that we have. What I'm referring to as decolonial Palestinian feminism is very much rooted in a project of Palestinian feminism that has multiple trajectories historically, both in the homeland in Palestine and in what we call the Shatat, or in the diaspora, in still expanding diasporic spaces. And women's practices of creating spaces of autonomy and freedom have a rich social, political, and cultural tapestry that both preceded the conditions of British and later Zionist colonialism and formed the groundwork for confronting the challenges of different colonial occupations in different ways. So, for example, we can look to the early histories of what we call the Palestinian women's movement, which really centered on creating charitable organizations and networks that were led by primarily upper and middle class Palestinian elite, but nonetheless contributed to a sort of burgeoning and vital Palestinian civic life that was in conversation with other spaces of cultural, political, and intellectual exchange in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa region. So even in these early stages, while we don't see what we might think of in our terms today as sort of a gendered political consciousness, we can see the seeds of an oppositional consciousness, to use Sheila Sandoval's terms, right, where women were growing a particular kind of gendered kind of consciousness, right? And the conditions of a Palestinian feminist or gendered consciousness really began to proliferate after the beginning of British rule in 1917. So women started to organize political organizations early on in response to British rule. For example, the Palestinian Women's Union, which was formed in 1921, led massive demonstrations against the Balfour Declaration and organized the first General Palestinian Women's Congress that took place in Jerusalem in 1929. And women also played a pivotal role during the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. They organized demonstrations, they started a boycott of foreign goods, they smuggled weapons to the rebels. There were kind of numerous phases in what we now, looking back, identify as the growth and development of a Palestinian women's movement. And that continued, of course, in the wake of the Nakba, and continued growing women's political participation in various spheres, in both private and public spheres. Now, in terms of kind of recent events, there have been a number of really important feminist developments. I think one of the more important developments in recent years has been the growth of what we know as the Talat movement, which is a movement that began in 2018 after the murder of Isra Ghraib, who was a young Palestinian woman in Bethlehem. And so the Talat movement was born along with this slogan that basically says there is no liberation without the liberation of women, right? So this is sort of a contemporary elevation of one of the primary aspects of a kind of feminist consciousness in Palestine, which has been that we need to tie our liberation as women within the Palestinian community, within our own community spaces, within our families, within our community to liberation from Zionist colonialism. So these forms of liberation are intertwined, right? And we witnessed a decline in sort of women's formal political participation in the wake of the Oslo Accords, which really, in a number of feminist scholar and activist analyses, depoliticized the women's movement, right? Because in part, it hinged on the transformation of our anti-colonial liberation movement into a state building project. And that brought a number of changes to the women's movement itself. Some scholars like Islah Hajjad have talked about the NGOization of the women's movement, right? So we went from a very active politicized women's movement that was invested in anti-colonial liberation to the creation of sort of NGOs tasked with these new sort of ideas around incorporating gendered equality as part of a broader development scheme, right? Or what some people have called governance feminism. And so that has been one of the primary challenges, I think. But again, a new generation of feminist activists, including folks like the Talat movement, have really been repoliticizing the Palestinian women's movement and re-elevating the need to deal with various aspects of gender oppression and violence within our communities as vitally interconnected with our liberation from colonialism in Palestine. And of course, there are interconnected movements that have also taken place in diasporic spaces, including in the US. I probably don't have the space to talk about that too much here, but I can drop a couple of articles perhaps in the chat for further reading if anybody is interested.
So much, Sarah. There is a question that, so in terms of any kind of thoughts or ideas that you might have in relation to divestments from Zionism and decolonization, what kind of form of government would a future state in Palestine take, a decolonial state? Do you have any kind of ideas about this question that various people are interested in different ways, but this is kind of the general gist? What kind of government would that be that would rule over all the people in a decolonial Palestine?
I think that's a really important question, and I wish I had a response to this. I think there are a lot of youth, a lot of women's organizations, a lot of various actors in Palestine and in the diaspora who are working to build alternative forms of community and kinship and care. But I'm not sure personally what kinds of governance structures might grow out of that. I think there's an element to sort of anti-colonialism that doesn't necessarily depend on these known kind of frameworks, right? I think there's definitely, in many cases, not in all, but a divestment from the very structure of the state itself, right? And I think that's part of what I was trying to sort of push in some of my comments, that there's a divestment from the state because of the logics of state nationalism that have been so destructive to all of us, because they're so wedded to these other structures of violence, such as right, the category of race, the category of humanity, and the category of sort of gender and so forth and so on. And we need to find alternatives beyond the state. I think Palestinians, again, are creating the seeds of these alternatives, just as other indigenous communities and Black communities are creating in the midst of colonialism, in the midst of anti-Blackness, in the midst of these ongoing colonial structures of power around the globe. And there are various experiments and alternative structures, but I'm not sure where that will lead in the Palestinian case. I think that's something that is a question that we need to explore robustly. I don't know, Raz, do you have any ideas to add there?
No, I don't have any form ideas about the form that such a decolonial state might take. But I think that it's crucial, as you said, that we feel in a way trapped within the confines of the modern nation state system and all its components in a certain way. And I think we need to really work on thinking beyond that, imagining beyond that. And it's indeed a tremendous task. There is another question here that we have just a couple minutes, and if you could address the role of Palestinian Israeli organizations such as Women Against Violence in the Palestinian feminist movement, really just in a few minutes, because our time is fast running out.
Yes, thank you for this question. I personally have not been involved in any Palestinian Israeli movement work with feminist organizations or movements. Although, I can say a little bit historically from what I've heard from folks who have been involved. And I know this is just my experience. This is just my perspective, but I think that there has been a major disappointment in a lot of our communities who have sought to work alongside Israeli feminists, to the extent that there is still very much an investment in this idea of the Jewish state, in this idea of the colonial project, right? And it's difficult to move past some of those vital differences. I think there's a lot of space to organize collectively, but that requires a different set of conditions. And I hope that we can explore what that might look like collectively in the future. But at the moment, my work has really been in building spaces of community among Palestinian and Arab women in particular, and in thinking with our own kind of movement histories and strength, and creating more fortitude there.
We might have time for just one more question, if that's all right. I'll read it and see if you can respond in a minute or two. I'd be interested in hearing more about futurity, especially in relation to liberalism. What does the work towards anti-colonial liberatory futures do with a liberal Zionist future that seems to dominate US Jewish discourse, one that seems driven by governmentality? So it's about the international, specifically American Jewish world. Any response to that?
For this question here, Raz, would you mind getting us started on this question? I'm looking for this question.
It's towards the end. How do we consider how do we work towards anti-colonial liberatory futures? What do we do with the liberal Zionist perspective that dominates the American Jewish world and is very driven by attachments, right, to the modern state system?
I don't think that's a question that I can answer as a Palestinian. I mean, I personally, I think that's sort of what I was pointing to in my earlier comments, that it's clear that there is a deep psychic attachment to the idea of the Jewish state for various historical reasons, right? And that still very much, as you're saying, I think this is Jordan Corson's question, dominates our imaginary, our ability to imagine beyond that. See, it feels kind of trapped within this discourse. And I mean, for Palestinians, I think, speaking from my own experience, and again, I'm one person and we're a very diverse community, right? I don't think that that's our work. I think that that is a work of Jewish communities, and liberal Zionists in particular, have to do that work themselves and have to really consider what that investment is in, right? And yeah, I mean, I hope that there's a willingness to do that work, but we have our own work to do.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And with this, there's so much more to talk about, but our time is run out. And with this, I return it to you, Deborah.
So I thank you, Sarah and Raz. I thank you for this conversation, for the way that you interact with each other, for the work each of you does, for your participation in this event. And indeed, many thanks to everyone, to speakers and listeners for joining today. Thank you for your participation in our program this whole year, and of course, for joining this afternoon. This particular conversation prompts all of us to think and to think anew and to recognize the enormous tasks ahead for all of us. So thank you and happy summer, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.